Good morning, everyone. My name is Carrie Rich with the Global Good Fund, and I'm delighted to welcome you here. I hope you're safe and healthy at home. I'm here joined today by Olin Douglas of Motley Fool Ventures and Nazleen Bimji of the Global Good Fund.
Hello.
Good morning. So to provide a bit of context, wanted to just share how this webinar came about. As you know, Motley Fool Ventures serves founders, and Global Good Fund serves entrepreneurs focused on social impact, and we both are trying to support our entrepreneurs through COVID-19. So we asked you what you wanted to learn about, and you all responded, we really need to learn about crisis management in terms of financial health during COVID-19. So we have an expert on the topic here today. We have the privilege of being joined by Olin Douglas, who's the managing director of Motley Fool Ventures, which is a $150 million early stage technology focused fund launched in 2018. And prior to becoming the managing director, Olin was the CFO of the Motley Fool. So he has a variety of background and experiences with venture capital, serving on the board of portfolio companies, as well as on the boards of nonprofit organizations, and is here today to answer all of your questions. Welcome, Olin. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Carrie. Thank you for inviting me.
Great. And the format of today's webinar will be the intro you just heard. I'll kick it off with some questions for Olin and I to discuss. As the webinar goes on, you can look at the bottom of your screen and you'll see a tab for Q&A. You can click on that icon and add all of your questions. And our colleague Nazleen Bimji will facilitate a Q&A at the end of the conversation. So this will be an hour total, about 20 minutes of back and forth between me and Olin, and then the rest of the time we'll focus on your questions. So Olin, let's kick it off.
Thank you very much. I was getting a little feedback, so I had to switch my headphones.
Sure, no problem. So we're focused on COVID-19, and for many people, this is the first unprecedented experience that we've gone through in terms of a financial crisis. But the reality is there's been several financial crises before. And the Motley Fool went through a dot-com bubble from 2000 to 2001, as well as the recession in 2008 to 2009. Olin, what were the biggest lessons from those periods as the company's CFO, and which learnings are most relevant to early stage founders today?
Thanks, Carrie, for that. Yes, you're right. There have been these downturns and crises before, and as you mentioned, there are some themes that you add to the ones you mentioned, plus the 1989, whatever, SNL crash, when I was an auditor of SNLs during that time, and you see some recurring themes. And for me, the biggest one, oddly enough, even from a financial standpoint, is to communicate. Is to really don't try to figure this out by yourself. There are a lot of people going through the same dynamic that you are, in whether it's your employees, your key partners, your audience. Please communicate with them to let them know what's going on. No one is going to be able to solve this alone. Everyone can do their part, but no one's going to do it alone. The other thing that has always been helpful is to scenario plan. And when we say that, we're talking about in the same way that no one really saw this coming, no one can really predict the future with certainty, when this is going to end, how bad it's going to be, all those things. And so we're really encouraging people to think about what would be a worst case scenario. Think about what the scenario that you think is going to happen, and make sure that you're prepared to deal with the various contingencies. A couple things, just kind of at a high level, we also ask people to do is to do something just in case the world doesn't end. Just kind of as an example with the Motley Fool, back in 2001, we had a lot of space. We were growing really fast, and when the internet bubble burst, it changed. And as we reduced our real estate footprint, we actually held on to one floor more than we needed for what we had right now, just in case business would recover one day. And as it turns out, the world didn't end. We did recover, and just having that additional space allowed us to move more quickly on the down to react to the change in the positive news. And at least for me, it was also always like a little sign of hope. It's really easy to get caught up in how bad things are, but to have visible sign. And people would always say, why do you have that floor? It was filled with furniture that nobody wanted. I said, because that's for the future. That's because we're going to get through this and we're going to need that. So it wasn't really expensive, but this idea of having some tangible symbol of what you're fighting for, I think is always really helpful. And that said, you have to be realistic and you have to be willing to adapt. If your business model doesn't fit the current environment, you have to make some decisions on whether there's a way that you can adapt, there's a way that you can improve the business, there's a way that you can change, or in the same way that there was probably a time when you said to yourself, this environment right now is perfect for this business. If that is true, the converse is probably true also. There's a time where your type of business is absolutely not perfect for what's going on, and you really have to be realistic about that. And if there's one silver lining from this is that everyone that goes through this, and if this is your first crisis, you will have learned. And the most important thing you can do is learn. And I remember coming out of 2001, making promises to myself and to the company about things that we would never let happen again, because we knew we could. And again, just that learning and building on it is probably, of all the things I said, communicating. If you can communicate and you can learn, there's the success. Then the scenario planning, I think, would be the next big thing, the tactical thing to really help you get through.
Thank you. And these are really helpful tips. The communicate, and you also shared, planning for a positive future with a tangible symbol of what we're striving for. Mm-hmm. Let's get even more tactical. Can you share with our founders and entrepreneurs what they should do to get their financial house in order? From a strategic level, what would you say are the three most important actions that founders should be taking right now?
So very tactical. When we look at companies and we're helping them do this scenario planning, we tell them the three high-level things strategically is to understand your status, like what's the shape of the company right now, and just really kind of going through, looking at all those costs and expenses and being really clear about where you are right now. Second one is understanding where your partners are, your key partners. This is a time where we all learn more about our supply chain than we ever knew before, where you may be dealing with someone who you think is in a great position, and then you talk to them and you find out that they're getting their supplies information from somewhere that's greatly impacted. And all of a sudden, understanding a little bit more about how your partner is delivering the service that they deliver. Who are they answering to? Who ties, who is it that controls their purse strings? A lot of times, especially if you have corporate partners, you're finding out that, jerks like me are on the other side of the old me, and the CFO are just stopping everything. And, people you've never known, people you've never talked to, all of a sudden are controlling your project. And that's just making sure that you understand how what you're doing fits in with your partners strategically. That's really, really important. And then as you go through both of those steps, just really kind of documenting what your options are. What can you do to adapt? What can you do to change? And what can you do to adjust? And finding out not only what those levers are, but what are the triggers that you need to have in order to pull those levers. And so really it's that, your current status, your partner status, and what are your valuable options.
Very helpful. Thank you. Again, focusing on a tactical level, can you lay out specific steps that are essential right now as entrepreneurs and founders look at the remainder of 2020?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then just kind of like diving even deeper, we get to an exercise. What I would suggest to everyone, the first thing you do is, obviously, hopefully your books are reasonably up to date and you have a good handle on where you are. If not, that's got to be job number one. I like to use the analogy of someone coming to you and saying, I'd like to, like on the phone, like on this video chat, if I told you I wanted to go to New York, it's not a good bad example, but the first thing you would probably ask me is, where are you? Because if you don't know where you are, it's impossible to give you directions, how to get from there to somewhere else. And so the first tactical step is make sure you know where you are today. And then I would say 3 steps to do. One is just do the analysis. If your revenue, which has probably already been affected, if it stays where it is right now, and you don't make any changes, how much runway do you have? That's just one anchor. Status quo, what's my runway? And once you do that, you can then start to think about, and that's just a data point. What we're trying to do is kind of paint the edges, and then you can decide the path you want to do inside those boxes. The next edge I would ask people to paint is, what would you have to do to make your cash last through the end of this year? So really, that's another 9 months or so. What kind of changes would you have to make? What kind of adjustments? And when would you have to make those changes? And then the last one would be, what if this lasts for a year and you have to make it all the way through Q1, Q2 of next year? What would have to happen in order for you to survive that? You will come up with a plan, and then part of your work, for all of those, part of your work is really stress testing it to see if it's how realistic it is. If part of your plan is signing that big deal with a customer that has suddenly gone dark, that's probably not a high probability option. And again, this is where the being realistic comes into play. When you look at those options and what you need to do, you really have to be honest with yourself about the probability of things happening that are not in your control. And banking on things that are not in your control is something that's it's really a high risk activity in times like this. So we're going to be careful about doing that. And then the other technical one is that if this is your first downturn, your first crisis, please ask for help. And every startup I've dealt with has advisors, has mentors, has fellow entrepreneurs that they kind of communicate with. Now is really the time to reach out to them and give them an opportunity to help you figure out a way through this, or figure out a way through this one way or the other.
Great. I'm just going to remind our participants, if you have any questions, to please put them in the Q&A section. And I'm going to keep going with you, Olin, for a few questions more. Olin, you've talked now a few times about the importance of working with partners. As you think about your negotiations on behalf of the Motley Fool with partners during challenging financial times, what are the most effective ways to approach negotiations with suppliers, vendors, and other key partners in this current environment? And what recommendations might founders and entrepreneurs hear from investors that are not in their best interest?
I've heard both of those for sure. And one of the things I will say mainly is the advice that I can give is really about how you want to deal with valued partners, people who you want to have long-term relationships with. If you are in a mindset where it's every person for themselves and you're just going to kind of crash and burn on the way to and on the way to getting what you want, I don't really know how to offer anyone advice on that strategy. It's not something that I've tried to do, and it's not something that I found particularly effective when people try it with me. So this is more advice for those partners and those relationships that you value. And again, it goes back to that number one rule of dealing with crisis: communicate. If you are struggling and you are struggling to make your payments, you need that deal to really get signed now. You're looking at your staff and your team, that negotiate, and all those are negotiations, but really it just starts with communication. Tell people where you are. If you've done the step before where you have your plan, you can even help them more by asking them, kind of giving them a sense of what you need, and then asking them how can they help. And what I found is really important in this step, and this is part of that plan and why you go through that exercise. You want to approach your partners with the idea that you have a plan that involves you doing something to get through this, and you need their help to achieve your plan. Very few people want to come away from a conversation feeling like they're there to bail you out and you're not going to do anything yourself. And so going to someone and saying, hey, I am struggling. I'm doing A, B, and C, and I would love for you to help by doing a little bit of D to make this plan work is much more effective than I'm hurting. Can I stop paying you? That's a tough one, and the reason why that's tough is that you're probably not the only phone call that person is getting, and so it just puts you in a more difficult position than you realize when you ask that, because there are probably more people who have already called before you and people who are going to call after you who are offering a much more palatable solution. And remember, the person you're calling is probably hurting a little bit also and is trying to figure out how to get through this the best they can. Um, but yeah, that's really important, is to ask for help, work together. Again, no one knows your partner's business better than they do. And so be careful about telling them how to help you as opposed to just asking what kind of help you need. Um, and a lot is going on now with the assistance plans and others, but landlords, for example, they run a different calculus. I mean, these are people who have buildings that last 25, 50 years, sometimes even longer. They go through up and down cycles. They have current cash flow concerns, but they want to keep the buildings occupied. There are lots of levers that they can pull, but you don't know which one of them is most palatable to them right now, because you would have to know the situation of every single tenant in that building. If you're a small office in a building that's otherwise run by the government, which tends to pay their bills when they start paying them, that your landlord may be a lot more flexible than if you're in a situation where all of the tenants are small businesses. That landlord's going to be struggling just as much as you are. But again, tell them where you are, tell them what you're doing to get your house in order. Ask them to be part of the plan, not the sole plan. And make sure, and that's probably the case anyway, but make sure they know that. Don't just assume that they know you're doing that. The other thing I would say is, and this is part of that, is to have empathy. Again, this COVID scenario is probably a clearer example than most of the crises we've gone through, where this is affecting everybody. It's actually no one is being unscathed by this. So have some empathy. Recognize that in the negotiation, maybe even asking them, how can you help them? Obviously you're limited. You may not be able to help them with cash or capital, but just making sure that when you reach out to these people, that you are, that you are there to, you need some help, but you're also willing to help in whatever way you can. And you never know without asking. And just the fact that you ask sets you apart. I think the only other thing I would say along with the negotiations is, again, this is a time where relationships are going to be formed, long-term and really, really strong relationships. So be thoughtful of that as you're working with people, even if you do not get what you want. How people treat each other during this time is really going to define what their opportunities are with those partners on the other side of this transaction. So just really be sensitive as you're negotiating that you're trying to get through a situation, but this is also a critical point in a long-term relationship.
Thank you. My last question, and then we're going to turn it over. I see there are questions coming in from the audience. What will the fundraising environment be like for startups during the remainder of 2020 and into 2021? And what advice do you have for founders and entrepreneurs who are planning to raise this year?
Okay, that's great, Carrie. I want to go back one more thing because I forgot the second half of that question. Some things that, let's say, you may want to think twice before you do. One of those is, now's not the time to ghost people. If someone is calling you and you don't respond, ultimately what's going to happen is you're going to get thrown into the machine, and that is, by the time that machine of we deal with you, we let the lawyers deal with you, or we let something else. If you aren't responsive to someone, you're giving them no choice other than to, follow the contracts and to really push for whatever remedies they can get there. It's really probably the worst thing that you can do right now. The other some of the advice to play is really playing hardball, especially when you don't have leverage. Again, if you are a small part of your partner's business, going to them and playing hardball is not going to help at all. Again, you're going to say, I'm not going to do something, and what are you going to do about it? And they're going to say, oh, we're not going to do anything about it, or whatever we do about it, I'll see you on the other side. But it's not going to be great how they respond to that. And I think even if you have a lot of leverage, it's still not a good result. People who are on top today aren't always on top forever. And again, people are going to remember when you had the advantage, how did you use that advantage? And then when I was at a disadvantage, how did you treat me when you knew I was at a disadvantage? That is what people are going to remember. And again, just try not to burn bridges. And I know there will be some bridges burned during this time, is because now is the time where you'll see who your real partners are and who the people that you do want to work together. So that's an outcome of this, but make sure you are aware of that. And then Carrie, to your fundraising question, it's an interesting time because VCs in general have a lot of what they call dry powder. When you raise a fund, you have commitments, but you haven't invested a lot of it. So the capital is there in a lot of cases. The challenge is that in order to invest, VCs, they have the capital and the appetite to invest. And I think what you're going to find during this time is that the criteria gets a little stricter, where it's a little bit harder to meet what the VCs are looking for. They're going to look for a little bit more stability in the companies that they're investing in. And one of the challenges behind that is that VCs have bosses as well. I mean, almost all of them raise their money from limited partners. Those limited partners are expecting them to execute a level of fiduciary responsibility with the number. And so you really want to make sure that if you're investing in this time, that you can demonstrate to your bosses that these are great investments and they make sense given all the uncertainty that's going on today. So again, that appetite comes from your business being relevant, your business probably being a little bit more mature than it is now. And the fact of the matter is uncertainty leads to lower valuations, and it's just going to happen. It's not necessarily anyone trying to take advantage of you, although I'm sure that behavior will appear at some point. But the higher confidence someone has in your business, the higher they're willing to value it. And the truth of the matter is, it's hard for anyone to have a lot of confidence in any business right now, right? And even the short term or the long term. And so, and again, it goes back to the original one. Have a plan for not being able to raise, because even if you wanted to, I mean, only a small number of companies are going to, the reality is only a small number of companies are going to be able to raise during this time. The bank is not going to be an option. If you think about the bank where you have your checking and saving account, banks are not the lender of last resort. They never have been and never will be. And so they're not, if they were a difficult option before, they're an impossible option now, and that's not their fault. It's just not their business model. And again, so I think the main thing you can do is look at your cost. I would say VCs are not, I would imagine that when this is all said and done, VCs are not going to ding you for having a difficult 2009 or 2020 year. In fact, if you're having a conversation with them after 2020, that's a good sign, because that means you made it. And that is, I think that's going to be where the bar is, quite frankly, is whether you make it or don't make it. So if you do your numbers and you decide you just need to hunker down for this year, then hunker down. I would not worry about what the growth trajectory looks like in 2020, because that's not the standard anymore.
That's great feedback. Thank you, Olin. I see we have several questions coming in, so I'm going to turn it over now to Nazleen with the Global Good Fund to facilitate our Q&A.
Thanks, Carrie, and thanks, Olin, for the very valuable, insightful information that you shared with us today. So I'm just going to go through some of the questions that have been posed and encourage everyone to continue to post the questions that you would like to ask Olin. So just sort of following up from what you talked about on the fundraising side, Olin, the question here regards the SBA loans that the new legislation has just passed, which are very attractive and in some cases forgivable if employees are retained. What is your opinion on the advisability of applying? What is the best way to initiate the loan process?
So that's a great question. And what I would say for everyone is apply. So there's two things I would say for that. Applying and accepting are two different acts. Get in line. The rules haven't come out yet as far as how those loans are actually going to be distributed. It's probably through your through an SBA lender. So if your bank is an SBA lender, that would be something where they would be able to help you. But step one, reach out to your bank and see if they're an SBA lender. If they're not, find one. Once the process starts, and it gets a little bit more complex than this, but the general answer is, I don't see a harm in applying and accepting the money if you qualify, and in fact you are being impacted by this, which almost everyone is. You're right. It is a loan. It's a low interest. It's a low interest loan. What's forgivable is you can borrow up to basically 2.5 times your payroll. So another way to look at it, you can borrow 10 weeks of payroll. And what happens is you can get 8 weeks of that forgiven if you don't lay off anyone during the period. So again, if you think about it, that you borrow 8 weeks, you borrow 10 weeks, you get 8 weeks forgiven. There is a small portion of that. Well, it's not that, but all of it will be forgiven if you hold on to it for 8 weeks. So all of it can go away if you use it as planned when you borrow it. I take that back. So it's all forgiven. If for some reason you have layoffs during the period of the time, then some prorated portion of that will not be forgiven. And you'll have to understand what the terms are when that's done. But again, it's a low interest loan. It's non-recourse, which means you don't have to put up any collateral. You don't have to put up a personal guarantee. And so I would encourage everyone who's been affected to apply. It's not entirely clear how long the money will last, which is another reason why I encourage people to apply that worst case scenario. But on the other hand, if you knew the money would last, then there's an idea, it's kind of almost like I say a game theory, that you would wait until closer to the end of the period. You have to apply by June. You would wait close to the end of the period because June would take you through July and August. So if you can make it through a few months without the loan, waiting to apply gives you more time for that to be effective. But again, you're taking a chance that the money is actually going to be there.
Thank you, Olin. The next question is around cash flow and hiring of staff. So this is the question. Should I go ahead and hire people I offered employment to, even though their salaries for now will put a burden on my business as there is no cash flow? So how much runway should one ideally have?
Yeah. It all depends on your business. I would say if you are one of the fortunate businesses where your demand for your services have actually increased during this time, then certainly hiring to meet that demand makes sense. If you're not one of those businesses, you're one that's been negatively affected, you have to be very careful about hiring. I would say it would have to be a critical position that you need to help you get through this situation. Again, this is where communication comes into play, and it might be just a conversation with that candidate. Say, hey, look, I know we put a job offer out there, but because of the environment, things are uncertain right now. Like, how do you want to proceed? because there's a chance that that person may be leaving a secure job to come to your situation, and you certainly don't want to put someone in a less secure position than they are right now. So if you like this person, you were ready to hire them, I would call them up and have a conversation. Say, I don't know what your current situation is. This is the situation you're walking into. If you want to come knowing the reality of that, we would love to have you, and we will work with you where we can. But if not, let's put this on pause, and we can revisit this once we have more clarity on the business outlook. So again, that communication is probably the best way to do that. So again, nobody has, I would say at this point, the most anybody has is half of the answers to this. And those are the really good people. And so again, making a decision about whether you should hire an employee hire a new employee, you have to understand that new employee's situation before you extend that offer. And that starts with a conversation.
Next question is slightly different, talking about strategic planning. So this is a question from someone who's a deputy at an established nonprofit. The question is, what's the best way to get the board and executive leadership to recognize that their strategic plan developed several years ago shouldn't necessarily be viewed as an immovable object in light of the scale and anticipated duration of the crisis? So more about how can a strategic plan be adapted and convinced of the leadership that it needs to be adapted for the current crisis?
I'm not sure on the board I'm on, that the team was very proactive in doing this, but I do think it's that exercise. What I would do is look at your operating budget for your nonprofit, and how much it costs to run that nonprofit. Make an assumption that your donations or your revenue sources are going to go down 10%, 50%, or 10%, 25%, 50%. And instead of, what I tend to find helpful is, instead of telling people you have to do X, saying this is what happens if this occurs. This is what happens if this occurs. This is what happens if this occurs, right? And then when they see the options, you're not necessarily telling them what to do, but then you can have a conversation about what to do if these scenarios come true, without forcing anyone to kind of commit to a particular scenario. And then the question for the board on a strategic basis is, do they want the nonprofit to survive? And can they count on donations regardless of the economic environment? It depends on what the foundation is, so I can't say for sure. But I know a lot of nonprofits are struggling, and they're seeing kind of the regular donations that come through the year just completely disappear. And the other thing I would say is, in all these affected areas, the states, the counties, the federal government, everyone is finding aid money to help businesses. Other than the federal government, only the federal government can print money. All this other aid money is coming from somewhere else. And we haven't heard that yet, but this is where the accountant in me with the debits and credits, if all of a sudden DC comes up with, I don't know, I'll just make up numbers, $20 million to help businesses, that $20 million came out of somebody else's budget. Time will tell where that money came from, but it's not going back. And I can tell you that when it comes to kind of some of the funding that nonprofits depend on, that is totally discretionary dollars. I can easily envision a corporate boardroom scenario where someone says, yes, I have $10 million set aside to help charities, but you know what? Right now, everyone's a charity. And so I'm moving that money from that pocket to help people directly today, right? And then we'll get around to talking to the charities, the real ones later. But money is being shifted, and it's being shifted away from things that can wait and things that have a lower priority to things that are being addressed now. So your board, again, I think the short answer is do the analysis, show them what happens if your donations and your contributions are cut by 10%, 20%, 50%, 90%, and ask them how do they want to plan for those scenarios, and then show them what's changed in the last. Show them March versus February. If you're someone that kind of raises money year round, I mean, most foundations have capital raising periods, but they also get streams of money throughout the year, little streams of money throughout the year, and look at what's happened between February and March.
Next question, I think, is more of a higher level question. How do you foresee global business in general adapting and evolving out of this?
That is interesting. I don't really have a good answer to that as things are going on, but I do think that typically coming out of this, people, we tend to be backwards looking a little bit. I think for me in global business, I think the biggest thing that will come out of this is not only how business is done. Zoom is not going away or whatever alternative, and so more and more businesses being conducted by video. But really on the global business scale, I think the biggest change is going to be with regards to supply chains and redundancy, and it's both. It's just people really understanding how to connect the dots of all the pieces that need to go together in order for them to run their business, and making sure that they have a bit of diversity in their supply chain. Being 100% dependent on a single supplier in a single city, in a single country is way riskier than we thought. It was operationally efficient, of course, but people are being exposed now to the risk of that. And I think it will become more commonplace to have some sort of redundancy relationships in the supply chain to allow for two things. One, for the replacement of services, and then as we're seeing in the medical industry, to have the capability to kind of ramp up production really fast for items that are deemed critical. So I think that will be the biggest issue. I think a lot of that honestly will happen on a national level. There needs to be national reserves to allow factories to quickly retool and quickly change to address critical needs.
The next question is related to that. If economies are shifting locally and VCs are running for stabler ground, do you see friend, family, and community funding gaining much more importance?
Yeah, I think that yes, but I don't know how much capital is there. So the support of your friends and family is going to be really important. I do think that kind of almost kind of a micro assistance is something that you may see at your local restaurant or your local shop, where people in the community are kind of coming together to help those businesses. And maybe there's a bigger push on Kickstarter and some of the other ones to kind of help out some of these small businesses. But I'm not sure that friends and family, even in good times, it was difficult for people to pull together friends and family rounds that are, several $100,000 in the millions, the type of money that people are raising for venture capital. I don't think individuals as a whole, even as a group, had that kind of discretionary capital to put at risk in startups. And so I think really what's going to happen is what will come more in vogue is, again, and it's kind of heading this way a little bit, is running your businesses more capitally efficient. So the idea that I'm going to raise a bunch of money and burn it all to take market share, and then raise more to burn it all and take more market share, and then sometime in the future, turn on the revenue engine and then make tons of money. I think that approach is going to be even less in favor after this. People are going to want to see you running a business where if things get bad, you can reduce your burn fairly quickly and very, very quickly and relatively easily.
So currently I have 2 more questions. I just want to encourage folks, we have about 17 minutes left for this webinar. So please put in your questions if you have any. Would you recommend that we continue marketing to prospective customers, or should we just continue to focus on our current ones?
That's interesting. It's a balance. I think if to the extent that you're marketing to any of your customers, just make sure that marketing is sensitive to the time that we're in. Being tone deaf is not really it's not really a great time to do that. And actually for this, I would love to hear from Carrie, because I know she has thoughts on this type of thing. So Carrie, why don't you give us some thoughts on this?
Sure. Well, I think it's a great question. We're asking ourselves the same thing at the Global Good Fund, and I think your point is how we're approaching the situation. It's just we're all going through the same thing across the world at the same, relatively speaking, the same time. So we're really focused on acknowledging that. And we're going back to the people who have consistently been our partners and marketing to them. And we are setting up conversations without hard marketing to prospectives who we understand their money is basically frozen at this point, but we want to be the first at the table for when the light turns back on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so it's always easier, and more efficient to retain a company, retain a customer than get a new one. So, focusing on the relationships that you have, as Carrie said, is outstanding. But to the extent the services that you offer are relevant to this time, I don't see anything wrong with making it known that you can be part of the solution. But again, you just have to be sensitive about how you market that.
Oh, and I have a similar question that came up earlier around the runway, just in terms of hiring staff. Could you maybe give an example of whether it's an actual number or a percentage of how much runway, sort of from a cash flow perspective, is ideal to have at this point?
Yeah. And thanks, Naslin, for following up on that. I didn't answer that the first time. So before the crisis, the idea that you would hear often is that people would say when you raise capital, you should raise enough to last you 12 to 18 months, 24 months. I think what we're finding right now is the companies that feel the most comfortable are the ones that have that 12 to 18 months of runway before they start raising money. We have people who have anywhere from a few months to a year, and they all are looking to add a little bit more cash to the situation. So I don't think there's an exact number, but I do think that coming out of this, people are going to realize that waiting until you have a few months of capital to start raising is not enough of a cushion. They're just things outside of your control that you need to address. And it's hard for a startup because it will affect your growth rates. But again, if you're growing your business for the long run and you want to be able to survive a wide variety of economic conditions, there's going to be trade-offs to that. But I would say anyone who has, when your cash gets below 6 months, you really should be worrying. That should be a flashing red sign that you're effectively out of capital. Because what people don't realize, and this is something that we learned through the downturns, there's a legal phrase called technical insolvency, where even if you have cash, it's clear you don't have enough cash to kind of last. So if you have 6 months of cash, for example, you're probably technically insolvent in 3 or 4 months, right? So that runway doesn't, you can't, bills don't come in evenly and revenue doesn't come in. If you're in one of those situations where you pay bills beginning of the month and revenue comes in at the end of the month, that's a disconnect there. When we were struggling at the Motley Fool in 2001, we did daily cash. we did cash every day, deciding who we're going to pay today, who we're going to pay tomorrow. I mean, it was that kind of rhythm, really checking it. But yeah, I would say everyone should try to make sure that at all times they have at least 6 months of their fixed operating expenses set aside to be able to comfortably run the business. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Olin. The last question I have, and again, encourage anyone who has last minute questions to put that into the Q&A, is how can we as founders demonstrate our adaptability and grit without compromising our mission?
Mm-hmm. Now, I think it's probably less about doing something to demonstrate it as much as just kind of doing it, not for anyone else, but just doing it for yourself. It's that adaptability and grit will be reflected as it's almost retrospectively in what did you do to help your company get through this crisis? Were you able to modify your operations to be more relevant in this situation? Were you able to kind of take advantage of opportunities that presented themselves to you? Could you move quickly enough to deal with them? Again, how did you treat your partners, that sort of thing? So that adaptability and grit is really the report card of how you make it through this process. And the way you demonstrate that it is really the things that we've been talking about, being focused on what levers you have, how you treat people, how you look at the business's mission, and are able to adjust to the times and staying true to that mission. All those things at the end, when you look back and like when you look back at it, we'll say, wow, you demonstrate a lot of adaptability and grit, but it's not something you kind of plan for. It's just, it's kind of the review.
Thanks, Olin. I think those were all the questions that came through. If you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with our participants, this would be great. And then pass it on to Carrie. Thank you.
Sure. I appreciate having the opportunity to talk to entrepreneurs about this. Again, we'll all be a little bit more of an expert once we get through this. And it is important to be to kind of maintain as much as possible a positive outlook on this. Make sure that you're working towards something that you believe in. Everyone is going to be working, long hours and doing a lot of hard work, and doing that for something that you think matters is really, really important. And so, speaking of important, I'll turn it over to Carrie for the last words.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Olin. This has been very informative, and we really appreciate getting to ask all of our questions to you. Just to conclude today, I'll give a brief summary, and then we'll sign off. So the first thing that Olin shared was the importance of communication. So communicate, and if you didn't know if you communicated enough, communicate. Understanding where you are right now, and also taking a moment to try and understand where your partners are right now. And then from a financial health standpoint, documenting your options to adapt, to change, and to adjust so that you can be around post-COVID-19. Understanding how much runway you have, ideally 6+ months, and what changes you have to make to last through year end, and just in case, make sure that you can last through Q1 or Q2 of next year. We talked about the importance of how to communicate with our valued partners and having a plan for if we're not able to raise, what staffing decisions and other changes we might need to make to be able to adapt to the current circumstances. And then lastly, really making sure that you're planning for a positive future. Of course, everyone intends to thrive after COVID-19. So what can we do today to make sure that we're thriving in the future? I'm going to thank Olin and thank all of our participants for joining us today. And on behalf of Motley Fool Ventures and Global Good Fund, keep charging forward and stay healthy and safe.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Carrie. Bye-bye, all.